reminder of a gentler world. In the land of the nation's power brokers. Vintage scenes for a film.
It is a disgrace that the Prime Minister said this yesterday. He should apologise.
In the real world, raw anger in the House of Democracy after Boris Johnson yesterday dismissed as humbug concerns about the safety of MPs.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
And hostility in Parliament towards the Prime Minister's chief strategist.
That tone of language is going down well, Dominic. That tone of language the Prime Minister is using is going down well in constituencies like mine. I've had death threats overnight. Should be dead. It's a disgrace. How can you get Brexit? I've had 3 opportunities to get Brexit from Theresa May's and if I could have voted for it, I would have voted for it. Don't tell me to get Brexit done.
A Labour MP who challenged the Prime Minister in the corridors of Parliament is disappointed.
Boris Johnson will do whatever is best for Boris Johnson. It doesn't matter how many people are arrested trying to kick down the door at my office. It doesn't matter how many death threats I get. If it's going to work for Boris Johnson will carry on doing it. I wish that he chose to lead. Instead, he's chosen to divide.
The Prime Minister appreciates his language could cost him support.
But you're losing the possibility of Labour votes to get agreement in the House of Commons.
Well, I mean, I think that's a reasonable anxiety, and I need to reach out across the House of Commons to
you
get
need
people...
to watch your language more, don't you?
I think it's fair enough to call the Surrender Act what it is. I think it's absolutely reasonable. But you're also right, Peter, that we do need to bring people together and get this thing done.
A meeting of the political cabinet as Boris Johnson told aides he regretted using the word humbug, but he will continue to use strong language to criticise MPs who want to delay Brexit.
Ben Wallace, I'm very well.
I'm fine.
You're
How are you?
a mild-mannered one-nation Tory.
I am, definitely. We all are.
Have you been disappointed by the language used by your very good friend Boris Johnson?
I think everyone is passionately believing about something, and that's what
Passionately believing in something?
people passionately believe in the debate, and we've got to resolve it. That's why we've got to leave Europe.
But has he not alienated people?
Excuse me, do you believe Boris Johnson?
Now, you've known Boris Johnson a long time. What did you think of the language he used last night? Were you disappointed?
Parliament is a very unhappy place at the moment, but I think Boris stayed well within the margins of normal discussion in Parliament.
And is there a danger that using that sort of language could actually alienate sort of Labour MPs you need to get a deal through?
But I don't think Boris used intemperate language.
It's extremely harmonious cabinet, as always is.
But Parliament's not so harmonious.
Well, I think the Prime Minister is doing absolutely the right thing to try and get a deal, but we're determined that we will be leaving on the 31st of October, preferably with a deal, but if not, then without a deal.
A symbol of stability where the nation's differences are normally resolved. Impasse on Brexit, provocative language outside.
Well, Nick Watt is here with the latest. An intervention this evening from a former Conservative Prime Minister.
That's right, Sir John Major. He's saying tonight that he fears that Boris Johnson is planning to embark on what he calls a piece of political chicanery. And he thinks that Boris Johnson is planning to come up with a way of suspending the Act of Parliament that is designed to ensure that Britain's membership of the EU is extended if no deal is reached by the 19th of October. And John Major is saying that Boris Johnson could do that through what is known as an order of council, which just involves privy councillors, rather than an order in council, which would involve the Queen. Now, it's certainly true in Downing Street they want to bypass this Act, and in an ideal world, they would cheat this Act.
What about the 27 other members of the EU? I mean, they must have been looking on over the last couple of days. What have they made of this?
Well, there's a fast diminishing confidence in the EU that we are going to reach a deal by that deadline of the 19th of October. And they've been watching what's happening here, watching these attempts to bypass the Act. And they've been coming up with their own ideas to ensure they can play their role, ensuring that the Act can come into force. So they believe that if the Act is triggered the request letter for an extension will be sent either by the Prime Minister or by a senior civil servant who would be instructed by a court. They fear that Boris Johnson would then come to Brussels and sort of under duress saying, I'm only complying with the will of Parliament, that could sort of scupper the extension. So what they're planning is at the European Council on the 17th and 18th of October, 2 days before the deadline in the Act, at that summit, they would agree that they would accept the extension request when they get the letter, if they get the letter, subject to there being a general election in the UK, which, of course, Boris Johnson supports.
All right, thank you very much. Well, as Nick was just telling us, former Prime Minister John Major has been speaking out tonight. Among other things, he described the government's approach as profoundly unconservative and argued it will do permanent damage to the party's reputation. Well, joining us now are three people who were all once within that party, but have been flung into different places by the ongoing political earthquake. In Birmingham and still in the Tory fold is Conservative MP Andrew Mitchell. Here in the studio, the former Conservative MPs, Dominic, Grieve and Anne Widdecombe, one expelled by Boris Johnson for opposing him, the other now a Brexit Party MEP. Welcome to you all. Andrew Mitchell, let's pick up those remarks by Sir John Major tonight, that the Prime Minister, who you support, has damaged the reputation of the Conservative Party with his appearances in the House of Commons.
Well, I haven't seen John Major's comments. This underlines the fact that we live in a country that is incredibly divided at the moment. These are divisions which are out of all proportion to anything I've seen in my 32 years in the House of Commons. And the answer, in my view, is to hopefully get a deal, but to move on and leave. We're mired in deep mud at the moment, and we have to make progress. And what I think everyone can accept is that Boris Johnson is trying to make that progress. He's made it clear he wants to get out by the 31st of October, preferably with a deal. And I think that is right, because until we do that, we're not going to be able to tackle these incredible divisions which disfigure our society and split families, parts of the country, and different constituencies.
Let's talk about what was said yesterday by the Prime Minister, for example, on the subject of the murdered MP Jo Cox. Now, you had a very good friendship with her, despite being on different sides of the House. I mean, your heart must have sunk when you heard him using that phrase about humbug, about female MPs and concerns about their safety in the context of Jo Cox's murder.
Well, I did feel uncomfortable about the Jo Cox's legacy being thrown across the chamber, but it has to be said that it wasn't the Prime Minister who started that. And I felt even more uncomfortable when I heard her husband speaking on the BBC this morning, who I also felt was very uncomfortable. And you think of the family and the children and so on. And I think it's very important that members of Parliament on all sides are extremely careful about the language that they use, notwithstanding the fact that this is a tremendously turbulent and difficult time which evokes incredibly strong emotions from people on all sides of the House. And at the end of the day, Mark, you know, I think that I look across the chamber, I see these huge divisions that are taking place. But most members of the House of Commons, wherever they stand in this argument, are trying to get to the right place as they see it for their constituents.
I wonder just whether you feel, moving on from that to his other language, the Surrender Act, this type of thing, that he hasn't made it much harder to get a deal, if indeed he can reach one with the 27 EU countries, through the Houses of Parliament.
Well, I think that the Surrender Act, I think it's being slightly overdone. You know, we've had death taxes, we've had this flowery political language.
Well, I think he used the phrase 12 times, didn't he, in his remarks?
I'm not worried about that. I'm much more concerned about the way in which language is being used to attack, particularly women in the House of Commons, and debase the nature of our democracy. So I think that, you know, you have a debate about whether it's a Surrender Act or not, but I think that's within the bounds of normal political discussion.
But does it make it harder? That's the key question. Are there MPs, Lisa Nandy, other people who were speaking today, who are just going to find it harder to support a deal if indeed he's able to bring one back from the European Council?
Well, it may or it may not, but the critical thing is not that language, in my view. It is the nature of any deal he can bring back. And I'm far more optimistic than others that in the end, in the EU, my experience is that these deals are done at the last minute, and that if it's going to come together, it will be at the last minute that it does.
All right, Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much. Now in the studio, Anne Widdecombe, I mean, what do you think about the threats that are being faced by female MPs in this atmosphere?
First of all, going back to the atmosphere of yesterday in the Commons, I think the nation really is utterly fed up. That at this time, when the issue is the future of the country, its independence, what is going to be agreed, all those major issues that haven't been sorted out in 3 years, and there the MPs are talking about themselves and the language that is used and all the rest of it. I actually think the whole lot of them now need to grow up and to listen to their constituents who are saying to them, get it done.
Do you trust Boris Johnson to get it done?
I trust him to try. Whether he will succeed, Mystic Meg couldn't tell you, quite honestly.
Well, Nigel Farage, after the verdict from the Supreme Court, called for his resignation. I know a lot of Brexit Party members disagreed with that. Some were on the same page, but where are you on that? I mean, do you think Boris Johnson should have resigned? Because
as far as I'm concerned, Boris Johnson is trying. I do not know that he will be successful. I wouldn't put any money on the 31st of October at all. But as far as I'm concerned, he is trying to deliver what the nation voted for, which is Brexit. Now, that deal that he is talking about, to me, is not Brexit.
So you want him to stay in situ, then, while he tries?
Well, I think what we might get if he went is something much worse. I mean, you know, but for heaven's sake, this isn't about personalities. This is about Brexit. This is about delivering what the British people asked for. But 3 long years.
But he's going to argue that he's the only person actually in a position to do so.
Well, let him get on and do it then, and we'll all cheer if he does. If he delivers a proper Brexit, that is, and not the surrender.
I wonder whether you might be tiptoeing back towards a Conservative whip.
I am not tiptoeing in any direction at all. I am firmly planted in the Brexit Party because it is the only party that is promising to deliver Brexit in line with what the British people asked for.
Dominic Grieve, let's just come back briefly to that speech by Sir John Major this evening. One of the things he was putting forward was he believed he had got information, as Nick was explaining earlier, that there might be an attempt to sidestep the Benn Act. And it's been reported today that people like yourself who helped to draft it had been considering this and how to prevent him doing it. What's the truth of that? Is that a real option, and what can you do to stop it?
I didn't entirely follow what John Major was looking at. I think he may well have been referring to the Civil Contingencies Act, which allows primary legislation to be suspended by order in an emergency. You certainly can't suspend this legislation. You have to show that the suspension is relevant to the emergency. It plainly wouldn't be. It would help bring it to an end in some way by suspending it. Actually, this legislation would bring the emergency to an end if it extends Article 50. All I can say is I'm confident that any attempt by the government to circumvent the Benn Act is going to fail. And I begin to think that one of the interesting shifts that we now have in our national politics is that number 10 used to be a source of information. It's now a source of fake news and disinformation, which is pumped out for propaganda purposes.
What is all this speculation from John Major, if not disinformation?
No, John has picked up that the origin of this story came from number 10. I'm quite confident about that.
Well, they've been briefing out.
They've been briefing it out. And I've begun to conclude that rather than briefing out fact, number 10 now briefs out fiction, because either they want to spread despondency amongst their opponents, or possibly they want to influence the negotiations with the EU. It's not clear to me which it is, but whichever it is, I'm confident that an attempt to stop the Benn Act working, if the preconditions kick in and he's required to write this letter, it will fail.
I mean, the supposition that there is something new about spin coming out from number 10 is unbelievable, Dominic, and you don't believe that. Come on, you're a lawyer. You don't believe that.
And there's a difference in nature and quality. Of course, there's been spin. But one of the things that really has made me aghast by the present Prime Minister is the sheer capacity for the recital of untruth.
We haven't got much time left, I'm sorry to say, but can I just ask you, before we wrap up, about this idea that the events in the Commons over the past few days will have alienated people who might have voted for a deal. Now, I know that's not your stance, but you talk to colleagues who might be considering voting or not voting for a deal, if indeed it's possible at this hour to do one. Do you think in that sense he has given up on a deal?
I think he may have done, because he certainly has alienated some of the people who he wanted to bring on side. If he wants to get a deal through, depending on what it has to be a deal which has support of a substantial number of Labour MPs. And Labour MPs yesterday were aghast, including many on whom I think he was likely to want to rely.